This is Chapter 10 of the American Government course, Elections. Let's talk about how our democracy, first of all, became progressively inclusive with more voters. Originally, only white men with property could vote. They discussed that during the Constitutional Convention and left that up to the states to decide those voting qualifications. And over time, as we get into the early 1800s, states progressively started to chip away at those requirements. In 1870, the 15th Amendment allowed voting for the former slaves. However, women were not still yet allowed to vote. We've already talked about how, as we get into the late 1800s, segregation starts to increase, particularly in the South. We see Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, which are still restrictive of voting of former slaves, blacks, and minorities. In the late 1800s, we came up with this concept of the Australian ballot, that fairly simple premise, but it's amazing how sometimes very simple things can lead to big changes over time. Prior to this, the parties pretty much controlled the elections. You went to get a ballot from that party. So when you went to the voting booth, you either had the red ballot or the blue ballot, so everybody pretty much knew who you were voting for. And around this time, they shifted to the ballot where all the parties' candidates are listed on one ballot. So it's secret, and all the candidates are listed on one ballot, so it makes the voting act a little bit more private, and it took a little bit of the control of the parties out of the election process. In 1920, passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and this is where I usually ask the ladies to volunteer what that one was about. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act extended voting to Native Americans. In 1963, the 24th Amendment eliminated that poll tax that we talked about a few minutes ago. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act opened up, particularly in the southern states, a little bit more voting rights, in that several states in the South were required to get federal approval before they made any changes to their voting requirements. And in 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 years old. So now that we have progressed over time to where we have what is referred to as universal suffrage, now that we can all vote, well, unfortunately, we don't. Our voter turnout in the United States is dismally low when you compare it to other democracies around the world. The average turnout for the U.S. presidential elections, which everybody is aware of, unless you've been living under a rock, we pretty much know when the next presidential election is, and it's still only about 55% turnout on average, significantly less than other democracies. It gets lower still for midterm elections, averaging around 37% for midterm elections. It did spike somewhat in the 2018 midterms, and it's even lower still, around 20 to 30% for statewide elections, and as low as 10 to 15% for local elections. So the Americans have a pretty low voter turnout. We'll talk a little bit more later as to why that is. Here's the voter turnout rates. In generally, we see it hovers around 55% for the presidential elections, and then hovering around 40% or so, a little bit lower than that for the midterm elections. Comparing with other countries, we see over here the progressively increasing voter turnout among countries. When we look at the United States here, fairly low down on the list, around 55% turnout. We do have a fairly high turnout of registered voters. So that shows that when we do make the effort to register, we have a fairly high turnout. But comparatively speaking, we are lower than most other democracies in the world. Interestingly enough, Australia's is pretty high, in part because they have mandatory voting laws. It's actually, there's a penalty for not voting. Sweden, however, one of the highest, does not have mandatory voting laws. It's just more of a culture that's socialized into a more of a voluntaristic culture where voting, more importance is placed on voting. Who actually does vote? Well, we see it's almost a direct correlation with age. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote. 65 and over has the highest voter turnout, and then it progressively gets lower from there. From 55 to 65 has the next highest turnout on down, and then 18 to 25-year-olds has the lowest voter turnout. We do see that it's correlated with higher education and higher income. That makes some rational sense because the more educated you are, the more likely you're to be aware of what's going on and more interested in voting. Higher your income, you may have more vested in society where it's into your best interest to know who's going to be doing this or that. So you might be more interested in voting. If you live longer in one place, this is what they call residential longevity, that the turnout increases quite significantly if you've been living in the same place for more than 5 years. Again, that's just another reason for you to be more interested or vested in the community. Volunteerism, which we mentioned, the higher the volunteerism rates are, the higher the voting rates are. And we also see that if you're registered, that you have considerably higher percent of turnout to vote, but only about 65% of the voting age population in the United States registers to vote. Talk about that again here in a minute. What are the major excuses for not voting? The Census Bureau broke it down into the major excuses for all voters and then broke it down just for comparison as to what the major excuse is for 18 to 24 years old. The interesting thing is that now, is this person going to vote? No, they're too busy. What's really interesting is that the top excuse over the years in both categories is that people are too busy to vote. And I put a question mark there because that might actually be an excuse or an smoke screen for what the real reason is that we'll talk about here in a minute. Because if you know, for example, 4 years in advance, the exact day that the presidential election is going to be on, and you already know you're going to be busy on that day, that's pretty interesting. Some of these reasons are a little bit more practical, considering we see that the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. Well, sick and disabled is a pretty big excuse amongst the general population. As far as 18 to 24s, don't know about candidates, perhaps confused on the issues. We see that not interested is one of the major excuses. Out of town is a fairly common excuse amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, particularly if they're off working into a new place or in college and they may not have registered or known whether or not they can register or have to go back home to vote, things like that. Don't like the choices is another common excuse as far as not voting. Not interested, again, hits the top there of the 18 to 24s. Now, there was an interesting flip-flop in the 2016 presidential election. Did not like the candidates or campaign issues, pretty much flip-flopped to the top excuse during the 2016 election, which means that a higher, as you can see, too busy was the top excuse up until this last election where they didn't like either one of the choices. What are perhaps some of the reasons behind being too busy to vote? which is pretty interesting when you consider the opportunities that people can have to plan ahead to vote. But what political scientists study is that do people feel like that the benefits that they get out of voting are going to be greater than the costs that they're getting from voting? And here it seems like maybe not. The time it takes to understand the issues, the time it takes to know who's running and figure out who you're going to vote for, the time it takes to get in the car and go to the voting polls and waiting in line or whatever those are the costs of voting. And is it going to make that much difference to me? So this ties right into does my vote matter? Does it really matter who the president is, for example, as far as my job goes? Is it going to make my job any better, or am I going to get a better job or get higher pay? Are we really generally uninformed? And yes, we probably are in general uninformed as to what the policies are, what the platforms are, who the candidates are, with respect particularly to 18 to 24s. But again, this is a general excuse all over, is that we are not necessarily all that interested in politics, perhaps don't even really care, might even discount the value of politics, which is unfortunate because the political organization is at the heart of every society. Everything has emanated from that. And if everybody had that same attitude, we have to be careful what we might end up with, more than likely a dictatorship if everybody didn't care. So by the way, just wanted to, this is my own public service announcement here. It is really very easy to register to vote in the state of New Jersey. You can go to this website here, which is the New Jersey Division of Elections, and then you can click on register to vote right there at the top, then click on your county. My county is Bergen County. So when I click on Bergen County, I get the 2-page voter registration application form right there. It takes me less than 5 minutes to fill that out. You can even print it out double-sided if you want, or you can just put the pages together and fold them, tri-fold them as they direct right here. And when you tri-fold it, you've got a nice little mailing envelope here that does not even require a postage stamp. So I guess the biggest challenge is to find a mailbox and then drop it in the mailbox, and you are registered to vote. It's quite simple, quite easy. You can even vote by mail in New Jersey. I will, before the semester's over, I'll even show you how simple that is. Who do we vote for in general? We see that partisan loyalty, that is the dedication to voting for that party, is the strongest predictor. We know that about 2/3 of Americans, and that's fairly evenly divided, 1/3 for the Republicans, 1/3 for the Democrats, are very predictable as to voting for that party due to their loyalty to that party. 1/3 of Americans, the majority of them actually lean to one party or another. And we only have maybe about 10% of Americans that are truly independent. But among that third there's other factors, such as we know the incumbent has the name recognition that we've already talked about that gives them also an advantage of being voted for. But there are some other personal interests that we take into consideration. Where you stand in the economy, for example, depends on where you sit on the political issues, and that could perhaps determine who you might vote for. Many people vote based on certain issues. They have a very strong, even maybe a moral preference for being for this or against this with respect to certain issues, and that's what determines which candidate they're going to vote for. We also see that there are certain candidate characteristics, such as attractiveness, what the candidate looks like, or this very hard to define characteristic of charisma, how well they speak, how well they exude confidence, how do that, what makes them able to do that. So those are some of the things that might influence who we vote for. And then when things aren't going well, particularly that 1/3 of Americans, and most definitely that independent bloc, which is what we would call the swing voter, they could literally turn that election back to the other party, to the other guy, when things are not going well. If the economy is tanking, we're in a recession, could switch to the other candidate, or if we've gotten involved in a war or a conflict that's not going well, that we're not winning, that could flip it over to the other guy. Again, I'm using that as a metaphor because we could have a woman winning office. Some quotes here. Everyone complains about politicians, but where do they come from? Ignorant citizens elect ignorant leaders. Put the blame where it belongs, on the people. That's from famed comedian George Carlin. Vote for the man who promises the least. He'll be the least disappointing. Let's look at how we vote in the U.S. election system. We've touched on this a little bit already. Looking at our House of Representatives, each representative comes from single-member districts. So there's one representative per district. That's outlined in the Constitution. That person can win by plurality, which means they do not have to have a majority of the vote. That avoids having to have runoff elections. Every 10 years, these districts are redrawn with the census, which is coming up this year. The state legislatures are tasked with the authority to redraw those state legislature, redraw those U.S. congressional districts. And we've already talked about a little bit, well, we'll talk more on this later with respect to the single-member districts, is how that promotes the two-party system. But we've already talked about gerrymandering, in that the party that's in control of the state legislature can redraw districts and will have the power to approve those because they have the majority, and they will redraw those districts in their favor to ensure that they maintain that majority. Here is the U.S. congressional district map of New Jersey with 12 congressional districts. There's the 9th congressional district right there that I live in. For the senators, they're voted on statewide elections. There's 2 senators per state. We've talked about that. They're voted for 6-year terms, and those elections are staggered so that both senators are not up for election in the same state. The 17th Amendment, back in 1913, talked a little bit about that progressive era. It's where he got taken out of the state legislatures into a popular election of the senators. They also win with a plurality of the vote, which means you just have the most votes. We do have some unequal elements with our Senate. California, for example, which has a population of 35 million, has 2 senators. Wyoming, which has a population of only 1/2 million people, also has 2 senators. We've talked about how the president is elected through the Electoral College. There is a total of 435 congressional districts, plus 100 senators, plus 3 more electoral votes given to the District of Columbia, and that gives us our 538 total electoral votes. In this case, according to the Constitution, the candidate has to win with a majority of 270, at least 270 electoral votes in order to become president. The winner-take-all system has evolved over time, which means that the candidate who wins the plurality of that state's popular vote gets all of that state's electoral votes. States figured out fairly early on that this was going to be in their advantage to do this because the presidential candidates would pay more attention to them if they would get all of those votes in one block rather than just being divided on a portion of the popular vote, which really wouldn't make that much more difference than the popular vote anyway. This electoral college system also helps to promote our two-party system because in order to win the majority of those electoral votes, a viable third-party candidate could prevent that from happening. So we figured that out very early on, that only two viable candidates are going to, pretty much guarantee the chances of one of them winning the Electoral College. So we'll touch on that again later when we talk about our two-party system. Looking again at some of the electoral vote numbers, California has 54 electoral votes, Texas 40. Populations are still kind of moving in those directions. Texas, because of the population shift towards the south, gained 4 electoral votes. Florida gained 2 electoral votes. And New York lost 2 electoral votes. Ohio lost 2. New Jersey lost 1, as I mentioned before. Several states, the smaller populated states, which have only 1 representative, that means they have 3 electoral votes for those states. Let's talk a little bit about campaign finance. We see that in the 2016 election, the person that spends the most money is not necessarily guaranteed of winning. As we saw here, that Hillary Clinton, or his total amount spent on trying to get elected, was considerably more than Donald Trump. We have a couple of different types of campaign finance. Hard money is considered the money that where there's a limitation on how much an individual can give. That is in order to minimize the chances for influence that contributor would have over that individual candidate. Soft money is the amount where it's unlimited that you can give to committees or groups, that then they would dole that out to more candidates. Some of the groups, political action committees, PACs, most organizations and corporations, private groups, have a political action committee as a collection arm that then they can distribute funds to candidates that they feel like would be sympathetic to their issues. 527 committee it's a tax and exempt organization that's engaged in political activity. 501Cs are considered nonprofit social welfare organizations, and they do not have to disclose their donors, which perhaps is an attractive element to some donors, and it's tax exempt if the political activity is less than 50%. So this is why they get scrutinized quite a bit, because they may be serving as somewhat kind of a front and claiming to be a social welfare organization when they are most definitely a political organization. The Citizens United versus FEC ruling that we touched on earlier equated corporations to free speech and took off the spending limits for certain groups, particularly if those donations were not coordinated with the candidate. This is where we see the creation of the super PACs since that ruling. This allows for unlimited spending as long as it is not coordinated with the candidate. So if there are people who want a certain candidate to get elected, they can go form their own super PAC and raise that money and spend it on whatever they want, as long as it's not given to that candidate or coordinated in any way with that candidate. And this has provided a vehicle primarily for spending on negative campaigns, which do seem to have some effectiveness on our System 1 thinking, our impressionableness, and that negative ads seem to grab our attention a little bit more than others, and lots of money spent on those. About $618 million was spent in 2016 by about 26 total super PACs, and campaign spending is increasing quite dramatically with each election cycle, which lends itself to lots of debate. This is what we call rent seeking, where money is spent that has no social value, and it is spent by groups in order to improve their positions, improve their profits. So while all that money that's spent really does not go to anything that has any social value, and that's why there's a constant debate back and forth. Is there too much money being spent on elections? How do we regulate that? Do we regulate that? And as a result, it can get very confusing with all the loopholes and rules and regulations of who can spend what, how much, to who. Let's just talk a few minutes about term limits, which has come up quite a bit over the years, particularly as we see that elected congressmen keep getting reelected, and they are there for a long time and may be criticized as careerists or kind of building their nest and entrenched in those jobs. And then with the increased amount of money that's being spent on elections, do term limits have potential? There's no term limits at this time for U.S. congressmen. It comes up every now and then, but does not seem to gain traction. For one, you could imagine is that the congressman would have to approve this, which means they would literally be passing a bill that would be putting them out of a job. That's not real rational. But at the state level, there have been 21 states that have imposed term limits on their state legislatures. The reasons for doing that sound noble. It avoids the entrenchment idea that we've talked about for legislatures to get in there and then just build a career out of it. It allows for new blood to come in, stir things up perhaps. There is the potential to increase minorities in women. However, what has been studied is that we're not really getting those benefits out of term limits. And as a result, several states have repealed their term limits. What are some of the arguments against term limits? Well, if you like that legislator, it robs the voter the right to choose that legislator again to stay in office. There is perhaps some value to experience and being connected in seniority as far as in those chambers. Term limits do tend to shift power more to the governor, who is in charge of the executive branch, which is the bureaucracy. So therefore, we're giving potentially more power to the bureaucracy to try to figure out legislation, because the bureaucracy may actually have more experience than the legislators. And clearly the lobbyists would have considerably more power because they will be there spanning these legislators' terms, and then will be right there in place to try to guide these new legislators into what they would want them to focus on. And therefore, inexperience becomes a constant. Now, certainly could argue over how valuable experience is in policymaking when new ideas come up all the time and policy has to be made on issues that these legislators know very little about, have to figure out, have to use lobbyists to help them figure that out. Legislators under term limits have been found to be less beholden to constituents because they don't have to worry about getting elected. They may be just pursuing their own agenda rather than public good. So as I've said, some states have repealed those term limits. So we're back to the same old dilemma. And we could literally just focus more on voter turnout, because the more people that turn out, the more likelihood that we would have of electing people that are competent. So one of the biggest alternatives to term limits or to complaining about poor legislators is to elect better legislators. Now, this is the Chapter 10 video lectures on elections. So stay tuned for discussion forum on that.